move focus to the story that we are bringing to you at this hour on the issue of the Ministry of Finance that is scheduled to introduce a bill in the ongoing winter session of Parliament for the privatization of banks in India. NITI Aayog has shortlisted the Central Bank of India and the Indian Overseas Bank for disinvestment. India has already witnessed unhealthy levels of non-performing assets or NPAs in the banking sector, a large number of banking frauds, and of course, a rather poor record of banks providing financial resources to MSMEs and other needy people. Under the circumstances, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's move to privatize public sector banks has met with stiff opposition from the banking sector. So while the union government has labelled it as a much-needed banking reform, there are apprehensions that this would tantamount to handing over the public sector banks to quote-unquote crony capitalists. So in a way, it's the same story playing out all over again regarding the reforms, the one that we saw with regards to farmers. And sure enough, farmer leader Rakesh Tikait has wasted no time in sweeping down into this situation to appropriate this cause as his new agenda now to target the centre for being pro-corporate, just as they did with the farmers' movement. So Rakesh Tikait has called for a nationwide agitation to protest the privatisation of banks bill that is scheduled to be tabled in Parliament tomorrow. So that will be the focus of our discussion, because we want to hear it from the domain experts about what this means. Because remember, 70% of the country's total deposits are with the public sector banks. So there's a legitimate fear and apprehension that handing them over to the private capital will put the common man's money deposited in these banks in jeopardy. What do the domain experts have to say? Let's welcome, joining us this evening here on Urban Debate, Professor Santosh Mehrotra, who's a senior economist, Ashwini Rana, founder of the Voice of Banking, also former General Secretary, National Organization of Bank Workers. Joining us also on the show is Saket Mishra, economist and investment banker. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on Urban Debate. But first, I would like to play out this report filed by my colleague Siddhant. He had, in fact, had a conversation with Mr. Rakesh Tikait, who says that this move is against the interest of the common man. Let's listen into that first.
हम भी तो आदमी है, बैंक निजीकरण में जाएंगे तो हमें भी नुकसान है। हाँ, भाई जा रहे हैं हम।
यही आंदोलन कंटिन्यू हो गया, नए आंदोलन?
नहीं ऐसा, ये कोई आंदोलन कंटिन्यू हो रहा। वे तो उनके लोग आते रहते हैं, पूरे उनके लोग।
क्योंकि आपने ट्वीट किया, आपके ऑफिशियल हैंडल से ट्वीट आया, तो सब ये सोच रहे हैं कि क्या राकेश टिकैत इसी आंदोलन का आधार लेके प्राइवेटाइजेशन के खिलाफ भी आगे लड़ाई लड़ेंगे?
ये आंदोलन यहाँ से नहीं जा रहा।
यहाँ से नहीं। ट्वीट कैसे आया राकेश?
नहीं आया भाई ट्वीट, कोई घटना हो रही, बिल लेकर आ रही सरकार, लेकर आ रही बिल, तो बता ना भाई, इस तरह के बहुत से बिल है जो सरकार लेकर आ रही। अब ऑर्डिनेंस फैक्ट्री सारी बिकेगी, बहुत साफ सुथरी तरीके से बेच दी, श्रम कानून बंद खत्म कर दिए, वे कोई अपनी यूनियन नहीं बना सकते, कोई वो नहीं बना सकते। धीरे धीरे प्राइवेटाइजेशन की तरफ जा रहे हैं, तो उससे बेरोजगारी फैलती है।
हर बार आप ये तो कहते हैं कि इस आंदोलन का राजनीति से कोई लेना देना नहीं है, पर मोदी और बीजेपी को रोकने आप हर जगह पहुंच जाते हैं चुनाव में। तो क्या यूपी चुनाव में भी अहम भूमिका निभाएंगे? बंगाल में आप थे?
बंगाल में तो वहाँ एमएसपी देने गए थे, वे चावल मांग रहे थे। चावल का और बीजेपी का क्या संबंध है आपस में?
आपने रैली की थी नंदीग्राम में।
हम तो उन्होंने कहा ये जो चावल मांग रहे हैं धान, इसका एमएसपी मांग लो, इससे ये कहने गए थे, वे फिर गए नहीं।
तो क्या ऐसे ही कुछ कहने उत्तर प्रदेश में भी जाएंगे?
अभी चुनाव आचार संहिता जब लगेगी जब बताएंगे, और अभी सरकार से समझौते की बातचीत चल रही है।
अभी बहुत अर्ली होगा।
अभी कहना क्या फायदा, अभी क्या वोट है, जब जरूरत पड़ेगी क्या कहना पड़ेगा उसी टाइम पे बताएंगे। अभी पॉलिटिकल एजेंडे पे ना हम बात कर रहे, ना हमारा एजेंडा है। हमारा एजेंडा है भारत सरकार कोई पॉलिसी लेकर आई, उस पॉलिसी को ठीक करवाना।
All right, we're going to keep the politics out of this, because what I'm looking forward to is to have a stimulating discussion with the domain experts. We have two economists, we have one insider from the banking sector. The idea is to understand the pros and cons of privatization of banks in India. I want to first go across to Professor Santosh Mehrotra, I beg your pardon. I want to begin by asking you, do you believe privatization of banks is a step in the right direction, sir? Because looking at it through the prism of the Indian middle class, do small businesses and MSMEs stand to lose once profiteering becomes the overriding concern?
Look, this is a long-standing issue. The bottom line is there are too many public sector banks. Even after the consolidation, the number came down from 22 to 12. The Ministry of Finance handles them all. It's incapable of handling them all. There is a case to be made for privatizing some of the banks. Secondly, there are too many small banks. You need much more strength within the banking system. But the problem is the government of India is not reforming the governance of the public sector banks and going ahead with privatization. If you're going to privatize some banks, but leave the other banks as they are without carrying out governance reforms, the NPAs are not going to come down. And that's the bottom line. Governance reforms involves a lot of things. You have already a situation where the stock of new credit that is being generated, the flow of new credit being generated by public sector banks is much smaller than the private sector banks. So while the stock of previous debt held by public sector banks accounts for 60% perhaps or more of total stock of debt, the public sector banks are too worried about lending given the environment. Not that there's too much demand either. So the bottom line is, yes, it's a step in the right direction, but you cannot just create a bad bank, clean sweep the bad assets of the current public sector banks, and pretend that all is well. All is not well unless you carry out governance reforms, improve institutional capacity in the public sector banks, improve their capacity to do due diligence. Otherwise, they will continue to make mistakes in giving out loans to inappropriate lenders. So the borrowers. So many things have to accompany privatization. You can't just decide, create a bad bank, privatize on the other hand, and voila, the problems of the banking sector, the public sector banks will disappear. They will not.
Okay, right. Professor Mehrotra, you raised a valid point. Will the problems disappear? Will the issues, the existing issues that we have with the banking sector, can this be a one-stop solution? Saket Mishra, I want to understand from you, and in the words that we just heard, that will this clean sweep of bad assets really help, if that is the interpretation here?
Afrida, I think we just need to break this process up into parts. The change in governance of banks, which involves improving processes, involves training people, involves checks and balances, involves actually making the boards of public sector banks freer from the Ministry of Finance, to put it bluntly, is very different from the privatization process. I don't think the two can be linked together. Privatization has its own imperative. It comes from the fact, and it's a very simple comparison. What do banks do? They take money from one side and they lend it to people who require money. They serve this intermediation function.
Yes.
Now, today's date, what's happening is that we have invested about 3.5 trillion rupees over the last 5 years, I think, in terms of capital of the public sector banks. The fact is that today there is a much larger pool of capital that is waiting to enter the Indian banking sector because we happen to be a very attractive economy. I mean, Indonesia and India are two economies in Asia where everybody wants to get into the financial sector. And therefore, for that pool of capital to be accessed, we need to start stepping into privatization of banks. Now, there are two issues that everybody talks about. One is the extent to which depositors will feel insecure because it is now owned by private people.
Yes.
Well, the fact is that if the government releases capital that is presently stuck in the public sector banks, that same money can be used to add in things like increasing the deposit insurance, increasing surveillance, improving the RBI's ability to regulate, and therefore I think the small customers will feel better. Similarly with MSMEs and with bank and that whole issue of crony capitalism. The fact is that crony capitalism or influence of large businesses exists today also. We can't deny it. So as new banks come in and as the private sector comes in, clearly there will be people who will be segmenting the market. There will be people who will be running digital shops based on blockchain and advances that we're seeing in technology that will allow the person in the village not to necessarily need a bank branch, but to be able to get a mudra loan just on his phone. And I think some of those advances happen when there is an incentive to people to perform better rather than pure security. Having said that, I think that it's also equally important that we acknowledge the kind of contribution that the public sector banking system has made over the years. But again, there is a time for everything to evolve with requirements of the world, with technology and how the country is going.
Time to evolve. Time to evolve is one of the arguments made in favor of this, also for all the reasons that you cited. One of the most interesting points that you made is about this pool of capital that is waiting to enter the banking sector, and we should make way for it. I'll take a quick reaction from Professor Mehrotra on this, please.
No, Saket makes a good point. But the fact of the matter is that the government is not thinking seriously about governance reforms in those banks which are going to remain in the public sector. Second response I have about what Saket said is about mudra loans. Mudra loans is not the only modality, by the way, which is going bad. NPAs and mudra loans are rising and rising. The mudra loan design is poor and it is showing very poor results. So the needs of the MSME sector can be met through MFIs and to the NBFCs. The public sector banks are quite incompetent and incapable of dealing with small transaction loans, which is what MSMEs need. Let the MFIs and the NBFCs handle that and give the RBI much greater powers to actually monitor the lending to MFIs and NBFCs, which have also, those are also loans which have gone back in the bad in the most recent past. It's absolutely critical. The RBI's complaints about its inability to monitor the banking system better, the Ministry of Finance constantly interfering. All of these things have to be addressed simultaneously.
Okay.
So while many of the things that Saket said I agree with,
okay,
there are cautionary issues that I'm raising which cannot be brushed under the carpet.
Absolutely. Former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan, in fact, has said that selling PSU banks to corporates would be a colossal mistake. He's also added that this will be politically infeasible to sell any decent-sized bank to foreign banks. So those are the issues, the points that we have heard. I want to bring in Mr. Ashwini Rana on this. Ultimately, we want to simplify this discussion. We want to understand, is it really going to be pro-corporate? That is the narrative being floated right now. Or will it be pro-people, pro-middle class, Ashwini Rana?
No, by seeing the decision of the government, it shows that it is pro-corporate. Because they wanted to hand over these banks to the corporates are big bidders. Because they feel that they will invest the money and government will not require to put any more capital infuse. But our thinking is that government should have their control in the public sector bank. They should not give the board or this operation control to the private. You can do reforms as per the requirement of the time. You can go for a more investor to invest in the banks by selling your share. But less than 50% share of public sector bank will be with the government only. Otherwise, what will happen? We have seen the private banks working, their board working, their performance during last year. So many banks, they are jumping. So public sector banks have a specific meeting the requirement of the people. And when it will go to the private sector, they will lend to the specific sectors. This ordinary people, ordinary businessman, MSME, they will not get the money from this private bank.
So that is a legitimate fear.
They will take more interest, they will take more charges from the depositors and
yes, which is why I began the discussion saying once profiteering becomes the primary concern, then who will look at the middle class, who will look at the MSMEs, the people who need the public sector units to be a bit more considerate beyond the profiteering. Now, what I want to also point out here is that a 2-day bank strike is being already announced on 16th and 17th. It's been called by the United Forum of Bank Unions. It's an umbrella organization. Also, All India Bank Officers Confederation has also said that if the union government does not give up this idea, it will launch a series of agitational programs. So it's very clear that within the banking sector, Mr. Saket Mishra, they do not, the stakeholders do not agree. There are concerns from within the sector, like you just heard.
Afrida, first I'd like to say that I agree with almost everything that Professor Mehrotra talked about earlier. I think we do need a very serious discussion on changing governance with the banks that stay. With due respect to Mr. Rana, I don't think the government has sold a single bank to a corporate yet from Raghuram Rajan's time onwards. And it's very clear that we are unlikely to sell to a particular corporate. The fact is that the world of investors, of simple people who are willing to invest in banks and large institutions that want to invest in banks as pure strategic investors, is much bigger than any corporate. Second, let's be real. Our banking system has, at least in the last 30 to 40 years, as we have seen with the Choksies and the Malias, etc., clearly only accommodated the largest borrowers. I have just come out of Uttar Pradesh and some of the poorer parts of various parts of the country. And I have, with my own eyes, seen the struggle that the common man has to actually access banking. And when I made the point about Mudra, it wasn't about whether Mudra is good or bad. My point was about allowing access to credit for the common person. And I think there is a huge issue there.
Yes,
finally,
yes, that's what we are raising, sir. Privatization will reduce availability of lending, of finance to the poorer sections.
That's the whole point. I don't think it does that. Tomorrow, think of a bank that is able to, think of a Bandhan Bank, right? It started off, 3 years ago? And think of the kind of retail level lending revolution that it spawned. There are NBFCs after NBFCs that are today taking on the same model of doing community lending, which was never actually there. So eventually, profits are not a bad word. Profiteering is a bad word, and that's something that the regulator needs to control to ensure that services are priced at a level that doesn't,
allow two quick points, Saket Mishra. I just want 2 quick answers. Firstly, if you can convince me that, this move to privatize the public sector banks will not hurt the priority sectors of the economy. This will not hurt the credit flow to self-help groups, for instance, to the rural economy. Give me a couple of points to establish what you're saying, that nothing will change in that respect.
The priority sector requirements can be met by MFIs, and as we've said, we're not. The government is not privatizing the entire banking sector. We can actually set up specialized sectors to provide that priority sector lending in a much more efficient way, mind you, than what is being done in a sort of sham way today, which is, one lends to SIDBI or one lends to NABARD or whatever in large chunks, and that becomes priority sector lending. Second, as far as I think you talked about access in the rural areas,
yes,
access will be available. We are having a telecom revolution in the country, and I think technology will drive access and will ensure that people actually, because eventually even the smallest of farmers in the most backward of areas of our country has an ability to save as Jan Dhan accounts have proved. Now that saving will want to be accessed by every bank. And
no, we may say that, sir, but the fear is around whether the private sector will exercise that kind of social responsibility. You have very rightly said that the profit is not a bad word. Profiteering is. What is to say that that will not be the guiding principle under all circumstances? I would allow Professor Mehrotra to respond. Yes.
Yeah. You see,
yes, Professor Mehrotra.
You're asking a good question, but I think Saket tried to answer that. Please appreciate. It is in the interest of private banks to lend to MFIs and to NBFCs, which will on-lend to small borrowers. You see, you're not understanding the intermediation role that MFIs and NBFCs have been playing and will continue to play, which in a sense, and please appreciate this, Afrida. I mean, I understand your sentiment, but please appreciate that public sector banks don't like undertaking these small transactions with millions of small borrowers. The public sector banks are averse to that. And the second tragedy is that working capital needs of MSMEs are the greatest. And the public sector banks hate to give capital for working capital needs. They like giving term loans once for all. एक बार transaction किया खत्म किया उसके बाद फिर बस पैसा बटोरते रहो. The NBFCs and the MFIs will be handled by the private sector, and the MFIs and NBFCs deal with working capital. Please try and appreciate that.
We are just concerned about a couple of issues. We are concerned about the social responsibility. We are concerned about making lending easy, accessible, affordable for the poorer sections. I'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us in this conversation here on The Urban Debate.